00201. How to deal with the Hulk. Ezekiel quickly scanned the room, and to his relief the seals held in place. Even though the walls around the room were still in place and standing. Everything that was in the room originally was destroyed and turned into shrapnel that now lined the edge of the room. Both Ezekiel in the mirror dimension and the Hulk in the real world glanced around the smoke-covered room for a few moments before the Hulk moved to one of the walls and touched it. A magical shield simmered around the Hulk's hand as he pushed on it. A moment later, the Hulk punched the barrier with his other hand, which made the entire thing light up. Ezekiel wasn't sure if the Hulk could break the magical barrier or not, but decided not to test it. Ezekiel quickly weaved a spell together to form a shield around himself and exited the mirror dimension as the Hulk pulled his arm back to punch the barrier again before Ezekiel said, "Hey, big guy." The Hulk looked over his shoulder to see Ezekiel, who smiled and said, "Please be careful and try not break that barrier. It's keeping all of this radiation contained so people don't get hurt." Hulk looked back at the shimmering barrier his other hand was touching before he stopped touching it for a moment. When the barrier disappeared, Hulk tapped on it with one finger to see a small ripple spread out in a circle from where his finger was. Hulk glanced back at Ezekiel before he asked, "Who you?" "Why Hulk here, little man?" Ezekiel weaved a spell together to collect everything in the shielded room as he said, "I'm Ezekiel. As for why you're here, I'm not sure of that either. But if you give me a minute or two, I'll help you get out of here." "Hulk, wait," the Hulk said as he glanced around the room a little bit before he turned back to the barrier and started to tap on it and watched the ripples flash across the barrier. The radiation, fire, smoke, and everything else was quickly gathered into a ball before Ezekiel made a portal next to the sun and threw the ball through it. The bright light attracted the Hulk's attention, who turned to look at the portal until it closed. Ezekiel quickly cast another spell which caused the barrier to flicker before it disappeared as he said, "All right, let me collect something and we can get out of here." Ezekiel flickered around the room to grab the runic spell wards he placed before he created an extra large portal and said, "Follow me, and I'll take you to go eat some food." Ezekiel stepped through the portal and waited for the Hulk, who glanced at the portal for a few moments and even touched the glowing edge before he stepped through it onto soft sand. Ezekiel and Hulk stood on a beach as the portal closed behind them, and Ezekiel asked, "What do you think? Pretty nice place, huh?" Hulk looked around at the beautiful beach in front of him as the waves slowly lapped the sand before he said, "Hulk-like." Ezekiel nodded before he pointed behind them and said, "Let's go over there, and we can eat some food." The Hulk glanced behind himself to find a simple, if a lot larger than normal house, with a 10-foot-tall door that was 10 feet wide. Ezekiel led Hulk to the house and opened the door to a living area with oversized furniture. The house itself was an open concept, and the dining room, kitchen, and living room were all one giant shared space. While the furniture was oversized, it wasn't comically big and a normal adult could use it too, but they would look a little small in it. Ezekiel led Hulk to the dining room where he started to pull out boxes of pizza and place them on the table. Afterwards, he pulled out a bunch of different 2 liters of soda and said, "Dig in. I wasn't sure what you would like, so I brought a nice selection for you to try." Ezekiel opened one of the boxes himself and pulled out a large slice of pizza and took a bite as the Hulk watched him. After a moment, the Hulk reached into the same box and pulled out one of the large slices and took a bite himself, which ended up being half the slice. The Hulk ended up finishing the first slice on his second bite and quickly reached for another one. As he ate the second slice, Ezekiel opened up one of the bottles and set it next to the Hulk as he said, "Try that. It's pretty good." Ezekiel reached for another smaller bottle and took a drink from it before he continued eating his first slice. The Hulk picked up the 2-liter bottle and copied Ezekiel as he took a large drink from it. After he swallowed, he looked at the bottle as he said, "Hulk-like fizzy drink. It's called root beer." Hulk took another drink, which caused him to drain a quarter of the bottle before he said, "Hulk-like root beer." Hulk put the bottle down and reached for another slice of pizza before he froze and grabbed his stomach. He made a weird look as he glanced down at his stomach and said, "Fizzy drink make Hulk tummy weird." Ezekiel, who just took another drink of his own root beer, put it down and said, "It's probably the carbonation. You just need to burp." "What carbow?" Hulk started to say before a massive burp erupted from his mouth and shook the windows. Ezekiel followed along with his own burp a moment later before he asked, "How do you feel now?" Hulk laughed before he said, "Hulk fine," and grabbed another piece of pizza. Ezekiel ate with the Hulk for about half an hour before all the pizza and soda was gone. Once they were done, Ezekiel cleaned everything up and asked, "Hulk, you want to watch something fun?" Hulk was rubbing his slightly full belly when he asked, "Watch." Ezekiel stood up from his seat and headed over to the large couch in the living room, which the Hulk followed him to. Ezekiel sat down on the couch, and the Hulk followed suit before they were both looking at a large TV on the wall that was currently turned off. Ezekiel glanced up at the Hulk as he said, "This is a TV, and you can watch stuff on it. To use it, you first have to say, 'Power on.'" The TV powered on to a menu selection that was very similar to the one Ezekiel created for Hela, except this one was currently curated with cartoons, some anime, kid shows, and learning programs for kids. Ezekiel pointed towards the TV as he asked, "It has a bunch of stuff on it that you can watch. Do you know how to read?" Hulk looked at the TV screen and the list that was on it with squinted eyes before he said, "Hulk no understand letters. Please switch to visual mode." Ezekiel said, which caused the screen to remove the words and switch to pictures then numbers. "Do you understand numbers?" Hulk shook his head, so Ezekiel said, "All right, let's put on something so you can learn numbers. Please play learning content focused on numbers." The TV changed to a playlist and auto started the first episode as music started to play before kids started to sing, "Sunny Day," sweeping the clouds away. Hulk started to sway along with the music as it continued, "On my way to where the air is sweet." Ezekiel ended up watching a couple episodes with Hulk before he stood up from the couch and said, "I have some stuff I need to do, but I'll be back in a few hours with something else to eat." Hulk glanced at Ezekiel as he pointed at the TV and said, "Hulk want cookie." On the TV was a blue monster eating cookies, which made Ezekiel smile before he said, "All right, I'll bring you some cookies when I come back." Ezekiel created a portal and stepped back out into Banner's lab, where he found a couple people waiting for him. Minato no longer had his mask on and was sitting on a couch that he grabbed from somewhere. Also on the couch was another blonde-haired man, and they were both currently using their cell phones. Minato glanced up first and said, "That took a while. I almost thought something went wrong." Ezekiel shook his head before he said, "No, it actually went better than I expected." The other blonde-haired man put his phone away and stood up as he asked, "Is it finally time for me to show off my art?" "Soon. I want to make sure the place is cleared out and no one will be in the blast zone. Also, you made sure to only plant explosives in and around Banner's lab, correct?" Ezekiel asked. "Of course I did. What do you take me for, an amateur?" Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he said, "No, but I also know you can get a little carried away when it comes to your art." The man was about to reply when Minato said, "I double-checked Daidara's work. Everything should be fine, even though it seems like he added more explosive clay than needed." Ezekiel glanced back at Daidara as he asked, "How much clay did you use?" 6 pounds. Ezekiel frowned as he thought over what he knew about Daidara's ability before he asked, "Wouldn't 2 pounds work for what we need to do? I'm not completely sure if this clay will work as well as the chakra-infused clay that I used to use." Daidara said with a shrug, "I thought you tested it." Ezekiel asked, "I did, with small-scale tests that underperformed." Ezekiel thought it over for a few moments before he said, "Whatever, as long as the explosion doesn't exceed the expected blast radius." "It shouldn't," Daidara said with a hint of uncertainty. Ezekiel glanced towards Minato before he said, "Have the team clear another half-mile, just in case." As Minato disappeared in a flash, Ezekiel opened a large portal to a warehouse full of stuff. He walked through the portal before he looked back at Daidara and said, "Come help me move this stuff." Daidara quickly followed Ezekiel through the portal and looked at everything inside the building before he said, "Do we really need to put all this stuff in the room? It's just going to be blown up once we're done." Ezekiel created a couple extra shadow clones to help with the task before he said, "This is just to make sure we dot our I and cross our T's." Daidara glanced at all the heavy objects in the room before he pulled out some clay and created a small centipede with it. He tossed it on the ground before he made a hand seal, and the centipede exploded into a cloud of smoke. A moment later, a 10-foot-long, 1-foot-wide centipede appeared and Daidara had it help him move a large desk through the portal. It took them about an hour to get everything into the room and into place before Ezekiel was satisfied. Afterwards, he checked in with Minato and the others who were in the process of dealing with the surrounding area. While it would normally be a busy area filled with people, it was currently spring break. So the total number of people currently still on campus amounted to a few dozen. For everyone that didn't need to be there, they were placed under a suggestive Jinjutsu that made them leave the campus and go do something else. As for the people like security guards and other personnel, they were also under Jinjutsu and kept away from the campus for now. The other positive thing about the campus was it was placed a few miles just outside of the city. Since that was the case, it made clearing the area that much easier. Once Ezekiel confirmed the area was cleared with his team, he moved out of the building to a spot a little ways away with a clear view of the campus. With everyone there, including the personnel for the school, he pulled all of them into the mirror dimension. Once there, he looked towards Deidara and said, "All right, go ahead." Deidara smiled as he looked towards the campus and said, "Remember to watch this closely because art is an explosion." The campus in the distance erupted into a massive explosion that destroyed over half the building and sent a massive shock wave out from it for over a mile. Ezekiel turned to Deidara with a glare as he asked, "What the hell was that? That was 5 times bigger than it needed to be." "But you said it was supposed to be an explosion caused by radiation, and nuclear explosions are massive," Deidara said as he tried to defend himself. Ezekiel shook his head as he pulled everyone out of the mirror dimension before he said, "You know what to do. And don't forget to edit the Jinjutsu so they remember the explosion." As his team took off to place everyone in parts of the building not affected by the blast and easy for them to get out of, Ezekiel moved to check out the damage himself before he met back up with his team and portaled everyone out of there. Once that was done, Ezekiel went to go visit Hela for a few hours before he collected some more food and cookies. 00202. Trying to talk with Banner. Ezekiel ended up hanging out with the Hulk for almost 10 hours, mostly watching kids' educational programs, until the Hulk started yawning. At that point, Ezekiel paused the TV and asked, "Hey buddy, you seem a little tired. Do you want to take a nap?" "Hulk, no tired," the Hulk said before he let out a loud yawn. Ezekiel stood up with a smile before he said, "Come on buddy, you're about to fall asleep on the couch." "Hulk, no tired," the Hulk said this time in a raised voice. Ezekiel nodded his head slightly before he said, "All right, you're not tired. But how about we take a quick walk to stretch our legs, and I can show you the rest of the house at the same time?" Hulk glanced at Ezekiel for a few moments before he stood up from the couch as he said, "Fine, Hulk, look at house." Ezekiel led Hulk around the house to show him the couple bathrooms and 2 spare bedrooms before he showed him the master bedroom and bathroom. Everything in the room was oversized, including a massive bed that dominated the room. Ezekiel patted the bed as he said, "Try it out, it's super comfortable." Hulk narrowed his eyes as he said, "Hulk, no sleepy. I just wanted you to try it out, but if you don't want to..." Ezekiel jumped onto the bed and spread out before he said, "Oh yeah, that's nice." Hulk stared down at Ezekiel for a few moments before Ezekiel waved a hand and said, "You can go back and watch TV. I am going to enjoy this bed for a little bit." Hulk glanced between Ezekiel and the bed a few times before he cautiously reached out and touched the bed. He put some pressure on the bed with his hand a few times before he said, "Bed's soft." "Yup, it's nice to lay on," Ezekiel said as he put his arms behind his head and closed his eyes. A few moments later, Hulk got on the bed and laid down too. Time passed, and after a while Ezekiel heard the Hulk's breathing steady out, and he waited for a little while longer before he sat up on the bed. Ezekiel glanced over at Hulk, who was laid out on the bed fast asleep. Ezekiel smirked to himself as he got up before he went over to the closest and grabbed another extra blanket, which he used to cover the Hulk. Afterwards, he left the room and created a clone to watch over the Hulk before he created a portal to his training room. As he stepped out of the portal, he was greeted by the sight of Fury, Tao, and Agatha. Fury had his tablet out, while Tao was playing on her phone and Agatha was reading a book. Fury was the first one to look up as he asked, "Since I didn't see any reports about a big green monster coming across my desk today, I assume everything went fine?" Ezekiel canceled his hinge and started to stretch his body as he said, "More than fine. Hulk is currently sleeping, and if everything goes correctly, Banner will be the one to wake up tomorrow. At least that's how I think it should work. Are you planning to recruit him or keep him separate from our group for safety concerns?" Theo shook his head as he said, Hulk will be fine. Sure, his power increases with his anger, but that's simple. Don't make him angry and just think of him as a little kid for now. I fail to see how you could consider the Hulk a child. While Banner and Hulk are technically the same person, you have to realize that Hulk was just born and is basically a child at this point. Theo said as glanced at Fury. Fury thought it over for a little while before he asked, Is that why the normal incident didn't happen today? Pretty much. I took him to the island, fed him, and then watched a bunch of kid shows with him before I put him to bed when he got sleepy. That sounds about right for a little kid. Agatha said as Tao nodded slightly in agreement. Fury raised an eyebrow as he asked, It was really that easy? Theo smirked as he said, Yup. The big guy is really docile if you don't try to attack him. Still has a bit of a temper like a little kid though, but it's easy to deal with. Fury started to type on his tablet as he asked, So you expect Banner to join us then? Depends on him and Betty. If they don't want to join, I'll get them set up someplace else to hide them from Ross if they want. Fury looked up as he asked, Are you planning to fake her death too? Maybe. Depends on what she wants to do after meeting Banner, but there is a good chance she will agree. Ross would never let her go otherwise. Fury turned back to his tablet as he said, That sounds about right for the man. Not going to criticize me for the Senate meeting today? Fury glanced up from his tablet as he asked, Would it stop you from doing something similar in the future? Nope. Fury turned back to his tablet as he said, Exactly. So there's no reason to waste each other's time on a pointless conversation. Tao's phone played some victory music before she finally looked up and said, We still need to set up that spell to contain Banner's DNA from being collected. We can do that tomorrow after I talk with Banner about what happened. Tao nodded before she stood up and asked, Ready for practice? Theo reluctantly nodded as he said, Yes, master. The rest of Theo's night was spent training, or more like being beaten up by Tao until he went to bed. Early the next morning after breakfast with his family, Theo created a clone which he sent off to school before he hinged into Ezekiel. His first stop was a bodega where he ordered over 30 breakfast sandwiches of different types and sealed them all away along with a bunch of drinks, sides, condiments, and some snacks. Afterwards, he portaled over to the hidden island and found his clone sleeping in one of the guests' bedroom. After having his clone head off to the base to go do something else, Ezekiel went to check on the Hulk and found Banner in the bed still asleep. Ezekiel pulled out some clothes he had prepared beforehand from the closest and placed them on a chair. Instead of waking Banner up, Ezekiel headed out to the living room and pulled out his tablet to work on it while he waited for Banner to wake up. The fallout from the Senate meeting yesterday was still all over the news as people debated if what everyone said was truthful or if they were forced to say lies. Ezekiel smirked to himself as he started to release all the information he had on the people from the meeting online. Most of it was bribes and the money transfers to link it to people and companies. He also posted videos of some of the meetings between the senators and company executives talking about taking action against Revival. As that information came to light, it was quickly forgotten about by other information he posted online. It was mostly the senators caught in the act of cheating with random women, secretaries, assistants, and even a couple maids. To say that overshadowed the rampant corruption he exposed would be an understatement. The photos and videos he posted were the most talked about thing on the internet within half an hour. Ezekiel wasn't an asshole though and made sure the women's identities weren't exposed and also blurred out all of the sexual content. But it was easy to tell what was happening in everything he posted. As for backlash, the senators that had yet to resign were calling for him to be arrested. Some of them were even trying to do legal actions against Vibe and Revival. Ezekiel just shook his head as he watched everything unfold online. About 2 hours later, Banner walked out of the bedroom and cautiously looked around before he spotted Ezekiel. Banner's eyes narrowed as he stomped towards Ezekiel and asked in a raised tone of voice, "What did you do to me?" Ezekiel glanced up from his tablet as he said, "Morning, Doc. Glad to see you finally woke up." Banner grabbed Ezekiel by the shoulder, and his eyes flashed green as he asked again in a more aggressive tone, "What the hell did you do to me?" "I didn't do anything to you. I even warned you not to do your little experiment." "You knew that would happen, didn't you?" Banner said as his eyes flashed green again. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I had some ideas of what might have happened, but nothing concrete. Also, you should really settle down." "Settle down? You want me to settle down?" Banner said as his voice raised. "Yes, Calm down, and if you would be so kind to not raise your voice because I am sitting right here, that would be great. Banner's eyes flickered back and forth from normal to green as his body started to expand, and he yelled out, "You want me to calm down?" Banner stepped back as his body started to expand and enlarge before he let out a massive roar that shook the whole house. After a moment, the Hulk was in Banner's place, and he glared down at Ezekiel for a moment before he tilted his head slightly as he looked around confused. Ezekiel smiled up at him and asked, "How did you sleep, Hulk?" "Hulk sleep good," the Hulk said before he narrowed his eyes and said, "You trick Hulk. Hulk say no sleepy, but you make Hulk sleep." "No, I didn't. You laid down and fell asleep yourself. Besides, if you weren't tired, you wouldn't have fallen asleep in the first place, right?" Hulk frowned slightly before he nodded his head slowly, which made Ezekiel smile again as he asked, "Are you hungry?" Hulk nodded before he pointed at the TV and said, "Hulk want to watch and eat." "All right, we can do that." Ezekiel stored his tablet away and moved over to the couch before he started to pull out food and put it on the coffee table. As he finished putting everything on the table, someone knocked on the door. Hulk glanced back at the door before he turned to look at Ezekiel, who also looked towards the door as he asked, "Do you want to answer it, or should I?" "Hulk, get," the Hulk said happily before he got up. Hulk walked over to the door and opened it before he looked at who was there and asked, "Welcome, Hulk House. Who you?" "I'm the Ancient One. It's nice to meet you, Hulk. May I come in?" Hulk stepped out of the way and waved her inside as he said, "Okay." Ezekiel glanced over his shoulder at Tao as he said, "Greetings, Master. You're just in time. We were about to eat breakfast. I guess I picked the perfect time to stop by then," Tao said as she moved over to the couch and sat down. After everyone was seated, Ezekiel handed Hulk one of the wrapped sandwiches and said, "This is a bacon, egg, and cheese." Hulk took the foil-wrapped sandwich in one hand and looked at it before he said, "Small." Ezekiel passed another sandwich to Tao and grabbed one for himself before he said, "Yup. I couldn't ask them to make extra large versions like I did with the pizza." Ezekiel and Tao unwrapped their sandwiches, which made Hulk do the same before they started to eat. While Tao and Ezekiel both took a bite, Hulk bit the sandwich in half. After the first bite, Tao reached for a bottle of hot sauce, while Ezekiel reached for a bottle of ketchup. Hulk watched them add their preferred condiment to their sandwich before he glanced at his own and asked, "What that red stuff?" "Ketchup. It adds a little bit more flavor to the food," Ezekiel said before he pointed at the bottle Tao used and said, "That's hot sauce. It adds flavor too, but also makes it hotter and a little spicy." Hulk held out his half of a sandwich as he said, "Hulk, try." "Which one?" "Hulk, try both." Ezekiel grabbed a couple sandwiches as he said, "How about you finish that sandwich while I prepare you a couple sandwiches with each of them on it?" Hulk nodded before he stuffed the rest of his sandwich in his mouth. Ezekiel quickly unwrapped a couple sandwiches and started to prepare them when the Hulk said, "More." Ezekiel glanced up at Hulk, who pointed at the sandwiches and said, "More red." Ezekiel shook his head before he said, "No, you don't even know if you'll like it, and it would ruin the sandwich. The point of condiments is to enhance or complement the food, not overpower it." "Hulk want more," the Hulk said with a pout. Ezekiel finished both sandwiches before he said, "Just try these for now, and if you like it, we can add more to the next ones." Hulk glanced at the sandwiches before he grabbed the one with ketchup and took a large bite, while Ezekiel went back to his sandwich. Hulk quickly finished the first sandwich and said, "Hulk like red sauce." As Hulk grabbed the next sandwich, Ezekiel said, "Remember, that one is going to be hot. Maybe take a smaller bite first." Hulk didn't even pay attention to Ezekiel's warning and bit the sandwich in half. As he chewed on it, his face went through a range of emotions before he quickly swallowed and said, "Too hot. Hulk no like red sauce." Ezekiel handed Hulk a 2-liter of soda as he said, "That's why I said to try a smaller bite." Hulk drank half the bottle as he looked at the hot sauce-covered sandwich in his hand for a moment before he ate the other half. Ezekiel shared a glance with Tao, who just smiled slightly as she took another bite of her sandwich. The next half an hour they ate while watching the TV before Tao showed Hulk some magic and placed a spell on him. It was to basically make any trace of his DNA disappear after an hour of leaving his body. Afterwards, they both left to go do other stuff, while Ezekiel left a clone to hang out with Hulk and promised to bring him more food for lunch. 00203, meeting Betty. It took almost 2 weeks before Ezekiel could have a conversation with Banner, since every time he saw Ezekiel he hulked out. Was it Ezekiel's fault? Partly, but that was only because he would goad the man into anger after the first week. Near the end of the second week, Banner could finally control himself, even with Ezekiel trying to anger the man, as he happily said, "It's definitely some kind of genetic flaw that makes all you geniuses idiots when it comes to common sense." Banner glared hatefully at Ezekiel, who smiled back and said, "I don't see why you're so upset. I just helped you gain a little bit of control over your new power." "Power? This is a curse. I never wanted something like this," Banner said as his eyes flashed green for a second. Ezekiel gave Banner a flat look as he said, "Says the guy who injected himself with an untested super soldier serum before blasting himself with radiation." Banner's eyes flashed green again for a moment as he said, "This is all your fault." "My fault? I warned you and you didn't listen, so don't try and blame this on me," Ezekiel said with narrowed eyes. "You didn't tell me I would turn into whatever this is," Banner said with a raised tone as his eyes flickered green a few times before he took a deep, calming breath. "You didn't ask. Besides, would you have even believed me if I told you what would happen?" Banner took a couple more deep breaths before he said, "No, I wouldn't have." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Exactly. So stop blaming me for problems you created." Banner frowned as he looked at the floor before he said, "I need to contact Betty. She's probably worried about me." "That's an understatement." Banner's head whipped up to look at Ezekiel as he asked, "What do you mean?" "It's been almost 2 weeks since the explosion. Betty and the rest of the world think you're dead," Ezekiel said as he pulled up his tablet and started to type on it. "2 weeks?" Banner asked before he froze and whispered in confusion, "Dead?" Banner's eyes widened before he grabbed Ezekiel's shoulder as he said with an urgent tone of voice, "I need to talk to Betty now. She needs to know I am alive." "Settle down, Doc. I am working on it. You just keep yourself calm, so Hulk doesn't come back out and we waste another day," Ezekiel said as he typed on his tablet some more. Banner nodded, but he was still agitated as he settled back on the couch and took calming breaths. After a few minutes, Ezekiel created a portal in the middle of the living room, and out of it stepped someone in Umbu gear, carrying Betty in their arms. Banner's eyes went wide and flickered green as he stood up and asked in a raised tone, "What did you do to her?" "Settle down, Doc. She just passed out from crying too much. She's be devastated thinking you were dead," Ezekiel said while the person holding Betty gently placed her down on the couch and disappeared. Ezekiel stood up himself and said, "I'll leave you both alone for now, but keep calm or the Hulk will come out. He won't hurt Betty, but it will be more time wasted and I have other things I need to do." Banner nodded as he moved next to Betty and gently woke her up. Ezekiel watched for only a moment before he created another portal and disappeared to go meet with Tao and Agatha. They were at the magic school on Genosha in the hidden underground lab drinking tea when Ezekiel arrived. Tao placed her cup down first as she asked. Banner finally kept his anger in check. "Yeah, we should be good to do the next part in a few days," Ezekiel said as he took a seat next to them. "You really think he will accept the offer?" Agatha asked as she placed her phone down to focus on Ezekiel. "I don't see why he wouldn't. He literally called it a curse a little while ago, and the Hulk hasn't even done anything bad. The only question is, will it work?" Ezekiel asked as he turned to Tao. "With the use of the Soul Stone, it shouldn't be an issue. While Banner and Hulk share the same body, after studying them both, I've determined your plan to split them apart will work. We just need to make some special arrays and set up the Soul Stone so we can split Banner's soul in half." "Sounds good," Ezekiel said before his tablet started to beep. Ezekiel picked it up before he let out a sigh and said, "I gotta go." "What happened? Do you need help?" Tao asked as Agatha also glanced at him with concern. Ezekiel shook his head as he stood up and said, "No, Banner just hulked out again. It should be fine, I think." Ezekiel quickly rushed to the island transportation hub before he portaled back to the island. As he stepped out of the portal, a woman said, "It's okay, Bruce. Whatever happened, we can get through it together." "Me no, Bruce. Me Hulk," the Hulk said in an angry tone as he glared down at Betty. Before Betty could speak, Ezekiel said, "Calm down, Hulk." Both Betty and Hulk turned to look at Ezekiel before Hulk pointed at Betty and said, "She call Hulk? Bruce. Hulk, not puny Banner. Hulk is Hulk. I know that, but she doesn't. Now tell her you're sorry for raising your voice, and she will apologize for calling you Bruce." Ezekiel said as he placed his hands on his waist and stared up directly at the Hulk's eyes. Betty looked like she wanted to say something, but when she looked at Ezekiel, who caught her eyes, he shook his head. After a few moments of awkward silence, the Hulk finally said, "Hulk, sorry." Hulk no mean yell. Betty glanced between Ezekiel and Hulk before she reluctantly said, "I'm sorry for calling you Bruce." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Good job, Hulk. I think you deserve a reward." The Hulk's eye lit up as Ezekiel pulled out a 3-gallon tub of ice cream and handed it to the Hulk before he said, "Make sure you use a spoon this time." Hulk nodded and went over to the kitchen where he pulled out an extra-large spoon, while Ezekiel motioned for Betty to follow him outside. As they walked out of the house, the TV turned out and started playing something that made the Hulk laugh. Once outside, Ezekiel turned to Betty and said, "Sorry about that, Mississippi Ross. The Hulk and Bruce are like oil and water right now, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, even though they share the same body." Betty nodded slowly before she asked in concern, "What happened to Bruce?" "Your dad wanted results and threatened to remove funding and separate you two if Banner didn't show any. So he attempted the experiment on himself, and well, you just saw the results." Betty frowned and thought over Ezekiel's words for a few moments before she said, "My father wouldn't do that. He knows how much I care for Bruce." Ezekiel pulled out his tablet and quickly found what he was looking for before he handed it to Betty as he said, "Watch this." Betty took the tablet and pushed play on the video to see Bruce in her father's office. General Ross basically browbeat Banner the entire time, and the longer the video played, the worse Betty looked. She shifted from anger, shame, regret, and back to anger as Ross told Banner he had a week to show results or he would never see Betty again. Once the video finally finished, Betty stiffly handed the tablet back to Ezekiel with a devastated look on her face. Ezekiel quietly left Betty so she could process her feelings and walked back inside before he took a seat next to Hulk, who was watching classic cartoons. As Hulk ate ice cream and laughed, he would sometimes nudge Ezekiel with his elbow as he pointed at the screen with his spoon. He was mostly pointing out things he found funny that he thought Ezekiel missed because he was working on his tablet. Ezekiel didn't pay attention to the time, but sometime after Hulk finished his ice cream, Betty came back inside. She ended up sitting on one of the large Lazaboy-like chairs before she turned to Ezekiel and asked, "Who are you exactly, and where are we anyway?" "I'm Ezekiel, and you are currently on an unnamed island, hidden from the rest of the world by magic," Ezekiel said as he looked up from his tablet. Betty frowned as she asked with a hint of skepticism, "Magic?" Hulk switched his focus from the TV as he nodded and said, "Ezekiel, do magic with red-haired lady." "Red-haired lady?" Betty asked in confusion. Ezekiel waved it off as he said, "My master, who taught me the mystic arts. She came by to meet Hulk." "I see," Betty said, but didn't sound very convinced. Ezekiel went back to his tablet as Hulk focused back on the TV as the group fell into silence as Betty wasn't sure what to do. After another cartoon finished, Betty asked, "When will I be able to talk with Bruce again?" Hulk growled slightly at the comment, but Betty was focused on Ezekiel when she asked the question, so he snorted as he turned back to the TV. Ezekiel glanced up at Hulk with a helpless shrug as he said, "Probably tomorrow, unless Hulk wants to be nice and help Banner out by giving him back control." "Puny Banner stupid. Hulk no help," Hulk said with a huff. "Looks like you have to wait until tomorrow. Do you want to stay here or head back home?" "I'd like to stay here if that's okay," Betty said cautiously as she looked between Hulk and Ezekiel. Ezekiel didn't care either way, but it was Hulk's temporary home, so when he didn't respond, Ezekiel elbowed him in the side. Hulk turned to look at Ezekiel, who pointed at Betty and said, "She asked if she could stay here. You're supposed to answer." Hulk glanced at Betty for a moment before he turned back to the TV and said, "You stay, but no talk about Puny Banner." Betty nodded hesitantly as she said, "Okay." A few minutes later, Ezekiel finished on his tablet before he stood up and asked Betty, "You want to take a walk for a bit?" Betty glanced at the TV and Hulk for a moment before she stood up and said, "Sure." After they got outside and walked down towards the beach, Ezekiel asked, "What happened early anyways?" "I've been helping Banner get his anger under control so he could talk with you, but he hulkied out again." Betty let out a sigh before she said, "We were talking about my dad and him rushing the experiment alone." Ezekiel nodded in understanding before he said, "Oh, okay. That makes a lot of sense. I still can't believe what happened." I hope we can figure out a cure, Betty said as she glanced out over the sandy beach and water that went to the horizon. Unfortunately, there's no cure. Betty turned to look at Ezekiel as asked, No cure? How do you even know that, when we haven't even tried? The same way I knew Bruce was going to perform the experiment alone. I can see the future, Ezekiel said as he watched the water lap against the beach for a few moments. Betty narrowed her eyes as she asked, You knew Bruce was going to try the experiment? Yup. I even warned him not to do it, but he was too stubborn to listen. Ezekiel said as he slightly shook his head. Why didn't you just stop him? Almost the entire school blew up, and people could have died. Ezekiel smirked as he asked, and yet not a single person did. I wonder why that is. After a few moments, Betty's eyes widened slightly as she asked, You saved everyone? Ezekiel nodded as he said, I knew no matter what I did, Banner would do the experiment one way or another. So I did what I could to help control it and keep people safe. Betty frowned slightly again before she asked, Say I believe you about being able to see the future, and it's absolutely correct. Is there really no way to help cure Bruce? I potentially have a way, but it would depend on if Banner wants to do it. Otherwise, it will take him years to come to terms with Hulk and accept that they are basically the same person. What solution did you come up with? Betty asked with interest. I don't feel like explaining it twice, so I'll tell you and Banner at the same time tomorrow. 00204. Separation can be painful. The next day, when Bruce woke up, he was greeted with the smell of breakfast being cooked. When he walked out into the living room, he saw Betty over in the kitchen cooking, which made him smile. As he approached, she turned around with a skillet in her hand. She smiled when she saw him and said, I was just about to wake you up. Bruce started to smile back before he frowned and said, Sorry about yesterday. I thought I had the transformation somewhat under control. Betty shook her head as she finished plating the food and said, No, it was partly my fault. I didn't want to believe you. Bruce and Betty spent the next half an hour talking as they slowly ate breakfast. Once they were done, they moved to the living room and just talked on the couch for a couple of hours until someone knocked on the front door. Betty and Bruce glanced at it before it creaked open a little bit, and Ezekiel said, Are you guys naked, or can we come in? Ezekiel let out a grunt of pain a moment later before he asked, What the hell was that for? You know exactly what that was for. A woman said before Ezekiel replied, I forgot you were a pervert like Toad Sage, and probably wanted me to just open the door. Ouch. Hey, not the face. Ezekiel said before he cried out in pain again. Bruce and Betty shared a glance before they got up and went to the front door to open it fully. Outside the door, they found Ezekiel bound to a tree by glowing red bands of energy as a red-haired woman poked him in the chest and said, Don't you dare compare me to that pervert. Ezekiel, with a red handprint on his face, glanced over towards the door and smiled at Bruce and Betty as he said, Hey guys, looks like you were dressed. What exactly is going on here? Betty asked as she glanced between the red-haired woman and Ezekiel. Ezekiel tried to shrug as he said, My master has a temper worse than your boyfriend. I personally blame it on her red hair and teenage hormones. She also has a BDSM fetish, which is why I am forced to call her master and currently tied up like this. Betty's eyes widened slightly as Tao turned an icy glare towards Ezekiel and said, Just for that comment, you're getting extra training for 3 months. 3 months, Ezekiel said as the color drained from his face. Tao nodded as she added, Full contact sparring for the duration too. Ezekiel looked like he lost the will to live as Tao turned around and said, Mississippi Ross, Dr. Banner, I'm the Ancient One. Sorry for the late introduction, but my apprentice likes to run his mouth. Both of them glanced at Ezekiel, who was still tied to the tree, with a hollow look in his eyes before they turned back to Tao. Tao smiled at them both as she said, Can we come inside? We came here to discuss something important with you. Sure. Come on in, Bruce said as he stepped out of the way and gestured into the house. As Tao walked towards the house, the spell binding Ezekiel disappeared, and he was released from the tree. He slowly followed Tao inside, and once everyone was settled down in the living room, Tao turned to Ezekiel, who looked depressed, and asked, Are you going to tell them why we're here? Ezekiel glanced up at Tao, who raised an eyebrow before she nodded towards Bruce and said, This was your idea. You explain it to them. Ezekiel slowly glanced at Bruce before he asked, Do you want to get rid of Hulk? Bruce nodded quickly as he said, Yes, of course I do. Betty frowned as she asked, "You told me yesterday that Bruce and Hulk were the same person? How could you get rid of one of them?" "We want to split his soul in half and give each of them half of it," Ezekiel said with a monotone voice. "My soul." "His soul?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Yeah, it will be the best way to split the two of them apart." Bruce frowned as he asked, "Souls are real?" Betty nodded in agreement to Bruce's question before she asked, If souls are real, wouldn't splitting his soul in half be a bad thing?" "Souls are pretty resilient, and any damage they take will heal after a while," Tao said before she pointed at Ezekiel and said, "He regularly damages his soul, and it heals within a few days to a week. That said, the more a soul is damaged, the longer it takes to heal," Tao said to Betty and Bruce, who still looked unconvinced. After a few moments, Ezekiel asked, "So what do you think?" Bruce shared a glance with Betty before he said, "I'm not sure about the soul part, but if it can get rid of Hulk, I'm willing to try it." Betty glanced at Bruce with concern as she asked, "I'm not sure about the soul being a real thing either. Are you sure you want to do something like this, though?" "Absolutely. I don't want to live the rest of my life knowing at any moment I could lose control and change into that thing." "Hulk isn't a thing," Ezekiel said with a slight shake of his head. "I don't care what Hulk is or isn't. I don't want it taking over my body anymore." Betty reached over and took Bruce's hand and gave it a squeeze before she said, "Okay, do it, and I'll be with you through the entire thing." Bruce squeezed Betty's hand back before he looked at Ezekiel and asked, "What do we have to do?" Ezekiel glanced towards Tao, who stood up and created a portal before she said, "Follow me." Both Betty and Bruce looked at the portal cautiously as Ezekiel stood up and followed Tao through it. A few moments later, Betty and Bruce joined them on the other side before they followed them to the magic school in Genosha. As they entered the school, Bruce and Betty noticed the handful of people there practicing magic and started to discuss with each other what they could be doing. If it was innate powers or some kind of technology that each person was using to create what they saw. Ezekiel just shook his head but kept his comments to himself, since most science types rarely believed in magic at first. They moved to the bottom of the school through some hidden and locked passages before they arrived at the hidden chamber Ezekiel used to portal to hell. Set up inside the chamber was a large runic circuit that encompassed 3 circles in a line. The circles were connected together and made out of vibranium along with a few other precious metals. Each one was inscribed with runic script, and connected to the circles in the middle was a small stand. Bruce and Betty glanced at everything in the room as Tao moved over to check everything. As she did that, Ezekiel said, "In a few minutes you will need to stand in the middle circle after she confirms everything is ready." "What exactly is this?" Bruce asked as he looked over all the foreign runic script. Betty nodded in agreement as she added, "I thought you were going to use some special machines or something?" "We never said anything about using machines. This is runic-based magic and best used for rituals like the one you are about to go through," Ezekiel said as he pointed at the circles on the ground. Bruce shared a glance with Betty before he asked, "Is this safe?" "It's safer than the experiment you performed on yourself," Tao said after she finished checking the circles. Tao moved back to the middle circle and sat down next to the small stand as she said, "If you would please step into the circle in front of me, and we can get started." As Bruce moved towards the circle, Betty pulled him back before she gave him a deep kiss, and after she let him go, she said, "For good luck." Bruce had a stupid smile on his face as he walked over to the middle circle where Tao said, "Please sit in the middle of the circle." As Bruce sat down, Ezekiel motioned Betty to follow him as he stepped back from the runic spell scripts on the ground. Once they were near the entrance to the chamber, he touched a ward on the wall and injected magic into it. A soft, glowing barrier appeared in front of him and Betty and blocked them from entering back into the chamber fully. Once that was in place, Ezekiel said, "You might not want to watch this part." Betty glanced at Ezekiel with a slightly frown as she asked, "Why? What's going to happen?" "He's about to be ripped in half," Ezekiel said as Tao took out the device that contained the soul stone and placed it on the stand. Betty's eyes widened and her voice raised as she asked, "Ripped in half? But you said it had to do with his soul." Ezekiel just nodded and pointed towards the circles where Tao was in the process of starting the ritual. As Tao waved the spell together, Ezekiel said, "She is splitting his soul, but also his body too. The Hulk has his own body, which is the same, but also different from Bruce." Betty looked at Bruce in concern as she said, "Maybe we shouldn't do this." You said he could learn how to control the Hulk, right? Too late. It's already started. Besides, Bruce wouldn't want to wait 20 years to figure it out. As the ritual began in earnest, Betty watched with anxiousness-filled eyes as orange-colored strands of light slowly wrapped around and through him. For the first few minutes, everything was fine. But once Tao unsealed the soul stone and weaved it into the spell, he grunted in pain. As Bruce started to moan in pain, Betty attempted to move towards him and was stopped by the barrier Ezekiel placed. Betty turned towards Ezekiel and said in an urgent tone, "You need to stop this. Bruce is in pain. She's hurting him. Did you think this was going to be easy? I told you. We're splitting his body and soul in half." Ezekiel said before he pointed towards Bruce and said, "This isn't even the hard part. It's why I said you probably shouldn't watch this." Betty turned to glance at Ezekiel, and when she caught his eyes, her eyes glazed over and she collapsed. Ezekiel caught her and placed her on the ground as he said, "That's better." After he made sure Betty was completely under Jinjutsu, he turned back towards Bruce, who was currently screaming in pain. It was a weird mix of him and the Hulk as he would shift in between each other. Part of his body was normal, while part of it was Hulk's larger green frame. As the spell continued and more streams of light came from the Soul Stone to connect with Bruce, a change started to happen. Slowly, he was pulled towards one of the runic circles, while at the same time Hulk was being pulled towards the other. It was amazing to watch, but looked incredibly painful as both Bruce and Hulk screamed in agony as it happened. It started with their heads first, which made it easier for both of them to scream at the same time. Slowly, the streams of light from the Soul Stone ripped Hulk and Bruce apart bit by bit. The whole process took almost an hour, and when it finished, both Bruce and Hulk were passed out in one of the circles. Ezekiel lowered the barrier when it finished and walked over to Tao, who stood up before she used a spell on Bruce and Hulk to lift them into the air. Tao then turned to Ezekiel and said, "They'll probably be out for a few days after what they just went through." Tao glanced towards Betty, who was on the floor, and asked, "What happened to her?" "She was freaking out after you started, so I put her to sleep." Tao nodded slightly before she said, "Let's take them back and then go start your training." Ezekiel started to sweat before he said, "It was only a joke." "I know, but your training isn't," Tao said with a smirk. 00205, placing bait. Tao was wrong about Hulk, who didn't take as long as she expected to wake up. He woke up a few hours later, and while he was happy to be free and have his own body, he was also pissed off at how painful it was and threw a tantrum that probably would have destroyed the house Ezekiel made for him if everything wasn't magically reinforced. Ezekiel was able to calm him down after promising to bring him cookies, ice cream, and pizza for dinner. Afterwards, Ezekiel left Hulk with one of his clones and checked in on Bruce, just in case he woke up early too. Instead, he found Bruce and Betty where they left them, asleep in a hotel room in Genosha. Over the next few days, Ezekiel's life became hell as Tao sparred with him every day to the point he was exhausted. He didn't want to do anything else after the training, but forced himself to visit Hela each day because she didn't like to hang out with his clones. So he always made sure to visit her in person and eat a meal together once a day. On the fourth day of training, Bruce finally woke up, so Ezekiel was able to take a small break from training to meet him and Betty. Betty woke up hours after the splitting process was finished and was informed by Tao what happened and to watch over Bruce as he recovered. She wasn't happy with Ezekiel for putting her to sleep, but she at least thanked Tao for helping them. Ezekiel knocked on the hotel room door after he arrived and waited for it to open. Betty opened the door and frowned when she saw Ezekiel before she asked, "I presume you're here to check on Bruce?" "Among other things. May I come inside?" Ezekiel asked with a friendly smile. Betty stepped out of the way and motioned him to come inside. Ezekiel walked past her and into the entryway where he waited for her to lead him deeper into the hotel room. Betty took the lead, and before long they arrived in the master bedroom of the suite they were in. Bruce was still in bed and looked worn out, but otherwise healthy. Ezekiel smirked at the man as he asked, "What's up, Doc?" Bruce frowned as he looked at Ezekiel before he finally asked, "Thanks for getting rid of the Hulk, but did it really need to hurt so much?" Ezekiel shrugged as Betty sat on the bed next to Bruce before Ezekiel said, "Couldn't be helped. We split your soul in half. Something like that is always going to have issues. I'm still not sure about the whole soul thing being real, but I'm glad it's over and I don't have to worry about changing again," Bruce said as he gently squeezed Betty's hand. "About that, We're going to need to run some tests first to make sure there won't be any lingering issues. Both Betty and Bruce looked directly at Ezekiel before Betty asked in concern, "What do you mean? Isn't the Hulk gone now?" "Yes, but Bruce's DNA was changed at the cellular level and needs to be properly tested for any issues. We can do that ourselves. We just need a laboratory," Bruce said as he looked at Betty, who nodded in agreement. "I'm sure you could, but that would require you finding a laboratory with the proper equipment, and that could cause issues, especially if the information leaked and Betty's father found out." Both of them frowned before Ezekiel said, "I already have the laboratory and people needed to do the testing. You can obviously double-check and run your own tests, but I want tests done by my own people." "What makes you think the information from your lab won't leak?" Bruce asked with a frown. "Besides the fact only my people know about the lab and its location?" Ezekiel asked, which made Bruce nod in response. "The servers aren't connected to the normal internet and are also protected by my own custom software," Ezekiel said with a grin. "What do you mean by normal internet?" Betty asked. "I created a private internet for personal use which is set up between all the projects I have running," Ezekiel said as his grin turned into more of a smile before he asked, "So do you want to get this testing done now, or wait a little while?" Betty frowned as she asked, "What will you do if he refuses?" "Put you both to sleep so the tests can be run," Ezekiel said as he shrugged before he added, "While I would rather have your cooperation and will gladly let you run your own tests." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed slightly as he said, "For the safety of the general public, I need to confirm there will be no issue with your DNA if someone got their hands on it." Bruce let out a sigh before he glanced at Betty and said, "I'm fine with him running tests. Besides, I want to run my own tests, and he is offering the use of a lab." Betty frowned but nodded in agreement, which made Ezekiel smile before he pulled out a wheelchair from his storage seal. He placed it next to Bruce's bed as he said, "With how weak you are, you'll need this." Bruce shook his head as he said, "I'm tired, but I can walk just fine." Bruce swung his feet over the edge of the bed and started to stand up before his body gave out, and he collapsed backwards onto the bed. Betty quickly went to him as she asked, "What's wrong?" "I don't know. It took everything I had to barely stand up," Bruce said as he attempted to catch his breath. "It's from the soul damage. It makes you incredibly weak, and it will be a month or so before you can use your body normally. The tiredness you feel won't go away until your soul is fully healed, though." Betty helped Bruce sit up, and as she grabbed the wheelchair, Bruce asked in an uncertain voice, "How long will it take to heal?" "At least a year or two, possibly longer." Bruce frowned, but said nothing as Betty helped him into the wheelchair. Once they were both ready, Ezekiel led them down to the transport hub and quickly created a portal to the medical lab. Both of them were quiet for the trip to the lab, but once inside the lab itself, they both looked around with their mouths slightly open. The equipment in the lab wasn't just state-of-the-art, it was beyond cutting edge, and Bruce's eyes went wide as he glanced at one machine in particular. Betty also noticed the machine and asked, "Is that what I think it is?" Bruce nodded slowly as he asked, "I think so, but I won't know for sure unless I check it out myself. But I thought it was still in development and years away from being completed. The one my father showed me wasn't even half finished," Betty said in confusion. Ezekiel glanced at the machine they were talking about before he chuckled and said, "That thing is almost 10 years old and is in the process of being replaced with something better." Both of them turned to look at Ezekiel in shock as Bruce said, "How can there be something better?" "Because aliens are far more advanced than we are, and we're in the process of upgrading all of our equipment with alien technology." "What?" Both of them practically yelled at the same time. "Geez, no need to be so loud," Ezekiel said as he pretended to pick his ear. "But aliens," Betty said with a look of disbelief that was copied by Bruce. Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he said, "Your boyfriend just turned himself into a big green rage monster not long ago, and you're surprised aliens exist? But that was backed by science. If aliens are real, why isn't it known to the world and instead considered a conspiracy theory?" Ezekiel shook his head before he said, "I swear, you science types are all the same." Ezekiel focused on both of them before he said, "Aliens are a guarded secret by governments around the world so the general population doesn't freak out." As both of them shared a look, the door opened, and in walked Orochimaru, Kabuto, Tobarama, Sarah Kinney, Maya Hansen, Aldrich Killian, and Beast. Ezekiel glanced towards them before he said, "Nice timing. I was getting ready to call you. Ezekiel pointed towards Bruce as he said, I want a full round of testing done on him. Sarah approached Bruce and extended her hand as she said, Dr. Banner, I'm Sarah Kinney. It's a pleasure to meet you. Your last paper on biochemistry in the NMJ was a fascinating read, and I would love to ask you some questions about it. Bruce shook her hand as he asked, Didn't you write a paper on genetic mutation a while ago? Sarah smiled, and as she released the handshake, she said, I did, but that was a long time ago. I tried to contact you about it because you brought up some interesting points and I wanted to discuss them in detail with you. But it was like you disappeared and no one knew where you went. Bruce said as Betty nodded in agreement. Ezekiel held up a hand before anyone else could talk and said, Before you guys go into some long and boring conversation about science. Ezekiel glanced at Sarah and said, I'm going to leave them here with you guys. Just call me when they want to leave. Sarah nodded, and before she could speak, Ezekiel faded away as an afterimage. Ezekiel headed back to get his training for the day over with before he took a quick nap, since Tao's training was kicking his ass in more ways than one. After his nap, he felt a little better, so he switched with his clone who just came home with his family and had dinner with them. Afterwards, he went to drop off food for Hulk before he headed to Genosha to meet up with Hela, with Tao, Agatha and Hela taking over the entire top floor of the hotel after Ezekiel gave them each their own suite. Tao decided to place a special teleportation area on the floor in between all the rooms and next to the elevators so they could just transport there instead of the island hub. It was keyed and protected so that only Tao, Agatha, Hela, and Ezekiel could make portals to it. Ezekiel stepped out of the portal and headed over to Hela's door before he knocked on it. About a minute later, Hela opened the door and smiled at Ezekiel before she stepped out of the way as she asked, How are you? I'm good. How was your day? Did you do anything fun? Ezekiel said as he stepped into the entryway of her home. It was fine. I mostly watched TV and sorted through more of the models you bought me. I think I figured out which one I'm going to build first. Ezekiel and Hela moved over to the couch in the living room where they sat down and started to chat as the TV played something. After an hour or so, they decided to go eat an early dinner together. While Ezekiel already ate a while ago with his family, he had a very fast metabolism and tended to eat 5 or 6 times a day. As they walked out of Hela's home, they were greeted by Tao and Agatha, who were in the hallway talking. Ezekiel waved as he asked, What are you two up to? Deciding what to eat. Agatha said as she turned to greet both of them, followed by Tao. After greeting each other, Ezekiel said, We were going to eat too. Want to join us? Tao shared a glance with Agatha before she said, Oh, we wouldn't want to intrude on your date. Agatha nodded in agreement as she said, You two love birds, go have fun. Ezekiel rolled his eyes as Hela had the tiniest hint of a blush before Ezekiel said, I swear you two are worse than me sometimes. Tao and Agatha shared a laugh before Tao said, We were thinking about eating French food. Ezekiel glanced towards Hela as he asked, What do you think? It doesn't matter to me. Ezekiel made a portal to somewhere in France and gestured towards it before he said, After you. 00206. Time to think, or Ezekiel left Bruce and Betty alone for about a week as they performed test after test. He would still transport them back to where they were staying each day, but overall didn't talk much with them. They were engrossed in their own conversations most of the time anyway, so it didn't matter much. Once all the testing was finished and Ezekiel was satisfied with the results, he approached the couple while they were still in the lab and asked, So what do you think? Bruce looked up from the computer he was using before he said, While my genetic structure is slightly altered, it should have no adverse effects on my life. Betty glanced up from the machine she was at before she added, We just triple-checked all the results, and there is no chance of contamination even if someone gets a hold of some of his genetic material. Well, that's one less thing to worry about. But I will have Tao redo her spell so people can't study your DNA just in case. Bruce frowned as he said, What about me? I would like to be able to study myself. My new genetic makeup is fascinating and could lead to some breakthroughs in certain fields. While I am sure it could, you have to remember that you turned into a big green rage monster because of what you want to study. It would probably be good to leave it as is and not mess with it anymore. But it could help people. Betty said as Bruce nodded in agreement. Ezekiel let out a sigh as he pinched the bridge of his nose. After a few moments, he looked towards Bruce and Betty before he asked, Why are genius people so stupid sometimes? Both Bruce and Betty frowned, But before they could talk, Ezekiel said, "Do you know the story about Pandora's box?" "Story? You mean the myth?" Bruce asked. "No, I mean the story, because it actually happened. Anyways, my point is you wanting to study your changed genetics is the same as Pandora's box, except way worse. The good would never be able to outweigh the bad." Ezekiel said with a frown. "Hold on just a minute. You can't be serious with that. Pandora's box isn't real, because that would mean gods are real," Bruce said as he crossed his arms over his chest. Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he said, "Gods are real." Bruce shared a glance with Betty, who looked as skeptical as him before he turned back to Ezekiel and said, "Prove it." Ezekiel let out a sigh before he said, "Easy. Look at every story we have of them. Those are just myths." Betty said, "No, those are stories that turned into myths with age. Gods are a real thing, and the best way to think of them is by treating them like really powerful aliens. Because that's kind of what they are. There is more to it than just that. But on the whole, the gods of legends were just aliens who visited our planet and treated it like a playground at one point in time. Then why did they leave? And where did they go?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Fuck if I know where most of them went. I know where the Asgardians are, but the rest of them I have no idea." Asgardians? The gods from Norse mythology like Odin, Thor, Loki, and Hela. Ezekiel said with a tiny smile. "I said to prove it, not just tell me more random stuff and expect me to believe it." Ezekiel raised an eyebrow again as he looked at Bruce before he said, "Fine. I'll show both of you what I am talking about, and also show you what can happen if you mess around with your mutated DNA." Ezekiel's eyes changed into 3 Tomo Sharingan that spun slowly as he said, "Have a nice nap." Both of them passed out, and Ezekiel caught Betty before she collapsed on the ground. He took them over to the medical wing where he placed them on beds before he took off to go do something else while they were inside a Jinjutsu. He didn't need to worry about them waking up early either, since once the Jinjutsu finished they would fall asleep until he woke them up. Ezekiel ended up training with Tao and took a nap before he went to wake up Bruce and Betty. Both of them sat there silently for a while before Bruce finally asked, "That wasn't real, was it?" "In a sense it is, and at the same time it isn't." "How much do you know about the multiverse theory?" Ezekiel asked. Bruce and Betty's eyes slowly widened as Ezekiel smirked before he said, "Looks like you both know of it, so this will be a lot easier. But that's just an absurd and speculative theory, and there's currently no direct evidence to support it." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "While you and the general population might think that, it's not actually true. Everything I showed you could come true depending on the choices we make now and in the future, which is why I don't want you messing around with your changed genetics." Bruce frowned slightly, but after a few moments he said, "While I don't fully agree, I understand the point you want to make." "You don't agree because it could potentially help people?" Ezekiel asked, which made Bruce nod in answer before Ezekiel added, "If you wanted to help people, why were you working on a weapon program for the military?" "It wasn't a weapon program. It was meant to help improve soldiers and help protect them," Betty said as she looked to Bruce for help. "By turning them into super soldiers? All that would do is make the United States more aggressive. And don't tell me it wouldn't. I know how stupid people in power think, better than both of you supposed geniuses," Ezekiel said with a chuckle. Bruce looked like he was about to reply when Ezekiel said, "It's fine. You don't need to justify your actions. What matters is what you plan to do now. You have a couple choices in front of you. The first is the easiest one, and that is going back to your old life. You might be considered dead at the moment, but I could fix that easily. I would have to adjust both of your memories of what happened, but my group has secrets it needs to keep." Ezekiel said, "Adjust our memories?" Both of them asked at the same time. "Standard protocol for our group. While you only met a handful of people and have only seen this small facility, it still needs to be kept secret, so we would fix the potential security issue with false memories. Don't worry, you won't have any issues afterwards because we have a team specializing in mind alterations," Ezekiel said with a careless shrug. Ezekiel quickly smiled at both of them before he said, "But that's only option 1. Option 2 is you both come and work with us. You've met a handful of our people and saw our technology. You won't find a better work environment anywhere in the world or possibly in the universe if I'm being honest." As Betty and Bruce shared a glance together, Ezekiel said, "I would give you a third option, but 2 should be enough. Can we have some time to think?" Ezekiel nodded before he said, "Sure. I'll give you a week to decide what you want to do. Until then, I'll show you where you can stay. Ezekiel had them follow him to the portal room, where he created a portal to the inside of a building. Betty pushed Bruce's wheelchair into a cozy living room with big windows that looked out over a forested area. It was mostly trees, but there were small bushes and other plants they could see dotted on the red-colored ground. Betty pushed Bruce closer to the windows to get a better look outside and saw a small stream that snaked through the trees nearby. As they looked at the beautiful scenery, Ezekiel double-checked the kitchen and found it stocked with food. He pulled out a phone and placed it on the kitchen table as he said, "The fridge is stocked, and the TVs have access to pretty much anything you could ever want to watch." Betty and Bruce turned to look at Ezekiel, who pointed at the cell phone and said, "If you need anything, just contact me with this. Otherwise, I'll see you both in a week." As Ezekiel opened up a portal to leave, Betty asked, "Where exactly did you take us?" Ezekiel stepped closer to the portal, and just before he stepped through it, he said with a smirk, "Mars. I hope you enjoy it." The portal snapped closed as Betty glanced at Bruce and asked, "We can't be on Mars, can we?" Bruce glanced out the windows to the red dirt and frowned slightly before he said, "I don't know. But if that red dirt is ultisols in nature, it doesn't explain the trees here. These types of trees don't normally do well in this type of soil. Mars doesn't have trees in the first place, though." Both of them shared a glance before Bruce said, "Let's go check it out." Betty helped push Bruce outside, and over the next half an hour they explored the forest around the cabin they were dropped off at. While they were hyper-focused on the plants and trees, they didn't notice the sky above them until they came to a clearing with a small lake. Both of them froze as they looked up at the hazy red-tinged sky above them. Betty's eyes were wide as she took in the sight, and after a moment she asked, "How is this possible?" Bruce and Betty ended up exploring farther, and after another half an hour they came to the edge of the forest. In front of them was an empty and barren red-colored landscape as far as the eye could see. At first, neither fully believed they were on Mars. There is just no way it should be possible. That was until the roar of an engine filled the air and a sleek spaceship appeared in the distance. The ship approached them and slowed down before it turned slightly and landed without blowing dust everywhere. After a few moments, the rear of the craft opened, and out walked a black-haired youth with what looked like a very slim spacesuit on. He waved as he approached them before he said, "I stopped by because I picked you up on my scanners and didn't expect to see anyone else out here today." "Is this Mars?" Betty asked as she looked out over the red landscape. "Yup. Are you two new? I don't think we've met before. Ezekiel dropped us off here at a cabin, but we didn't really believe we were on Mars," Bruce said as he also looked out over the view before them. Shursway smiled as he said, "That sounds like something he would do. I'm Shursway, by the way." "Bruce Banner." "Betty Ross." They said one after the other. Shursway pointed at the ship behind him as he asked, "I was just about to go collect data to make sure the terraforming project was on schedule. Do you want to take a ride?" Bruce shared a glance with Betty, who mouthed terraforming, before he shrugged and turned back to Shursway and said, "Sure, if it's not a big deal." Shursway smiled again as he said, "It's not." Shursway helped push Bruce into the ship, and once they were both secured in their seats, he flipped a handful of switches. The ship slowly floated into the air, and a few moments later it launched into the air. Shursway turned the ship and tilted it to a turn to show them the massive forest below them and said, "That's considered Grove 1, and that's the cabin you were dropped off at." Below them, as the ship turned and continued to rise into the sky, they could see the cabin and the small lake not far away from it. Past that first forest was a giant landing pad with a couple of other spaceships currently docked in place. On the other side of the pad was a massive forest that looked like it went on for miles in all directions, except towards the pad itself. How is that possible? That forest and its trees have to be at least 100 years old, if not older. Why has nobody noticed what is going on here? Bruce asked in wonder. "We hide everything incredibly well. Also, you're wrong. Those trees are only a few months old at the most," Shursway said as he adjusted the ship's flight and set course for his first stop. Bruce was about to argue about how that was impossible, but after a few moments he let out a sigh and decided to just go with it. On their trip around Mars, they passed a few places that left them in shock, one of which being a massive body of water that Shursway said they were in the process of turning into an ocean. How they were doing that, Shursway didn't explain, but he did fly the ship into the water and through it for a little while to collect samples and data on the progress. They also visited the north and south poles of the planet, which were giant ice fields that covered a few thousand miles of land each. After checking the planet itself, Shui took them up into space where he collected some more data points before he finally took them back to the landing pad. After chatting with them for a bit and showing them the path to get back to the cabin, Shui said goodbye before he headed over to another ship to do something else. As Betty pushed Bruce back to the cabin, she asked, "I think we should take his offer. What about you?" Bruce was quiet for a little while before he said, "We would be stupid not to." 00207. Someone is jealous? The week passed quickly with Ezekiel leaving Bruce and Betty alone to think. While he didn't truly leave them alone since he sent Shui and a couple other people to Mars to interact with them. He even hid in the mirror dimension when they met Hashirama for the first time and watched him create an entire forest like it was nothing. You would expect at this point they would be used to surprises, but the looks on their faces said otherwise. Ezekiel portaled to the front of the cabin they were staying in before he knocked on the door and waited. A few moments later, Betty opened the door and stepped out of the way as she said, "Hi, come on in." Entering the cabin, Ezekiel found Bruce seated on the couch in the living room using a tablet. Ezekiel moved over to one of the chairs where he sat down as he said, "How's it going, Doc?" Bruce glanced up from the tablet in his hands as Betty sat down next to him before he said, "Pretty good. I can finally walk around without collapsing." "That's good. So did you two make a decision?" Ezekiel asked as he glanced between both of them. Bruce turned to Betty as he said, "I think we did." Betty nodded in agreement before she said, "We decided to accept your job offer." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I was hoping you would. We could definitely use people with your skill set. That said, you will both need to go through the vetting process before you are officially hired." "Vetting process?" Betty asked with a hint of confusion. Ezekiel pointed towards the window and the Martian landscape as he asked, "You will be working for a group that is terraforming Mars in secret, and you don't think we have a vetting process?" "That makes sense. It's just a little weird is all. Since you already offered us the job," Bruce said as Betty nodded in agreement. "I offered the jobs because I know you will both pass the vetting process without problems," Ezekiel said, after which he paused and thought over something before he added, "Are you both okay with basically disappearing from the world for a while?" "Disappearing?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "We tend to work in the shadows and almost all of our members are considered dead or have disappeared from the general public." Bruce didn't really have any family besides his cousin, so he didn't really care, but Betty had her father and asked, "What about my family? Will I be able to contact them or visit them sometimes?" "It's not recommended for the operational security of the group, but that doesn't mean it's out of the question. Any contact you have with your family will be monitored through. When you meet more of the group and find out our mission, you'll understand why that's needed." Betty frowned but nodded, which made Ezekiel smile as he said, "Good. Let's take you both to go start the process." Over a week went by since that conversation, and both of them passed the vetting process and physiological evaluations. They were assigned to the main base and were given their own lab next to the PIMs who they quickly made friends with. They were also allowed access to the medical base to help out with projects there if they wanted, but their main focus was in studying alien technology and reverse engineering it. Sure, Bruce's main skill set was nuclear physics along with Betty, but they had no need for that field of study currently. That said, they didn't complain since working with alien technology was fascinating to both of them. After they were settled in at the base, Ezekiel decided against giving them new bodies for now. With them both being younger and not being combat-oriented, he didn't see the need. As for the Hulk, Ezekiel left shadow clones to keep him company and was slowly teaching him. Hulk still talked in broken English, but his vocabulary was slowly expanding and he was getting better each day. He also really enjoyed video games that Ezekiel introduced him to. They were older, simple video games like Pac-Man and Frogger, but Ezekiel was slowly exposing Hulk to new stuff. Ezekiel was at Hellas hanging out with her as they chatted on the couch. Ezekiel was worn out from training with Tao, so he was laying down while Hellas sat close by. As they talked, there was a knock on the door. Ezekiel glanced towards the entryway as he asked, "Expecting anyone?" Hellas shook her head as she stood up and said, "No, but Tao and Agatha stop by every few days." "Don't they normally text you before they come over?" "Not all the time," Hellas said as she reached the door and opened it up. She glanced down in surprise as a younger girl with black hair smiled up at her and said, "Hi, I'm Gabby." Hella froze for a few moments at how upbeat the girl was, And in that moment, the girl walked right past her and into the penthouse as she asked, "Is Ezekiel here?" Ezekiel, who was on the couch, heard Gabby's voice, and as he started to stand up, Gabby noticed him. She quickly ran towards him and jumped to hug him as she said, "I knew you were here." Gabby's speed knocked Ezekiel off his feet and back out the couch before he said, "It's good to see you too, Gabby, but what are you doing here?" Hella quickly made it back to the living room to see Gabby hugging Ezekiel on the couch, which made her frown. Gabby released her hug as she said, "Ava came to visit her master, and I came with her. But then I smelled you and wanted to see if you were still here. So you dished your friend?" Gabby blushed slightly and avoided eye contact as she said, "No, we agreed to meet up later." "I'm sure that's what happened," Ezekiel said before he noticed Hella's frown and said, "Hella, this is Gabby. She is someone I helped rescue from a bad situation." Ezekiel turned Gabby towards Hella and said, "Gabby, this is Hella. I also helped her get out of a bad situation." Hella's frown disappeared, and she nodded curtly to Gabby before she said, "It's not polite to just enter a person's house without permission." Gabby's eyes widened and quickly glanced at Ezekiel as she asked, "This isn't your house?" "No, it's Hella's." Gabby frowned slightly and sniffed the air before she said, "But it smells like you live here." "Well, I do come here a lot, but it's not my house." "Oh," Gabby said in a nervous tone before she said, "Please don't tell my mom. I don't want to get in trouble again." Hella smirked the tiniest bit at that comment before Ezekiel said, "I won't if you apologize to Hella." Gabby moved over to Hella before she bowed her head slightly and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know this was your home. Please don't tell my mom." Hella glanced at the girl before she looked at Ezekiel, who was smiling. Hella glanced back down at the girl with her head still lowered before she said, "It's fine. Just don't do it again." "Thanks, you're the best," Gabby said before she hugged Hella, which made the woman freeze up. Ezekiel shook his head slightly with a smirk playing across it as he stood up. Gabby released the hug a moment later before she turned to Ezekiel and asked, "What are you doing now? Can we go ride the roller coasters together?" "I was planning to take it easy and just relax for today, since I'm not feeling great today." Gabby tilted her head slightly as she asked, "Aren't roller coasters relaxing and make you feel better?" "I think that really depends on the person in question. Do you find roller coasters relaxing?" Ezekiel asked with a raised eyebrow. "No, roller coasters are fun and exciting. But after I ride one, I always feel better though." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Well, roller coasters don't do the same thing for me." "Oh, well, what makes you feel better?" Gabby asked as Hella also curiously glanced at Ezekiel. "A lot of things. Hanging out with my family, hanging out here, taking a really hot shower or bath." Ezekiel was cut off as Gabby excitedly grabbed Ezekiel's hand and said, "I know just what to do." As Gabby tugged on Ezekiel's hand to get him to stand up, she turned to Hella and asked with confidence, "Where's your bathroom?" "What?" Ezekiel and Hella asked at the same time. Ezekiel said he likes to relax here and also in a hot bath, so we should put him in a hot bath here and it will be double relaxing. Gabby said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Ezekiel started to chuckle before he said, "While I appreciate the idea, I find it relaxing here because I am spending time with Hella. Then let's all take a bath together," Gabby said with a hint of excitement. Ezekiel's eyes went wide as he glanced towards Hella, who also did the same. Gabby grinned as she asked, "It's a great idea, right?" "While I appreciate the idea, I doubt Hella's bath will fit all of us in it," Ezekiel said with a forced smile as he tried to politely refuse the idea. Gabby nodded in understanding before she asked, "Then how about we go someplace with a bigger bath?" "I don't think," Ezekiel started to say as Gabby cut him off and said, "Hot spring. It's like a bath, but really big." Ezekiel glanced towards Hella for help only to notice she was frowning slightly as she looked at Ezekiel and Gabby holding hands. Hella focused on Gabby a moment later as she asked in a flat tone, "How old are you, Gabby?" "I just turned 13 a couple of months ago," Gabby said with an infectious smile. Hella glanced between Ezekiel and Gabby for a moment as she thought about how old Ezekiel really was. After a moment, she narrowed her eyes slightly before she reached out and possessively grabbed Ezekiel's other hand. Ezekiel froze for a moment at the action before Hella pulled on his hand and said, "Let's go to a hot spring." "Yes," Gabby said as she bounced on her feet before she started to move towards the door. Ezekiel, who was now being pulled by both of them, asked with a hint of resignation, Shouldn't we bring a change of clothes or something? Also, don't we need to ask your mom if you can even go, Gabby? Gabby pulled out a phone and started to type on it with her free hand. As they reached the door, she flashed her phone to Ezekiel with a smile as she said, "Mom said to have fun and come back before bedtime." Ezekiel let out a sigh before he said, "All right." As they left Hella's penthouse and entered the hallway, they ran into Ava, Tao, and Agatha, who were next to the runic spell patterns for the personal portal hub they created. Tao smiled when she noticed Ezekiel being dragged by Hella and Gabby at the same time. Agatha also smiled before she asked, "What are all of you up to?" "We are going to a hot spring so Ezekiel can relax," Gabby said excitedly. "Didn't you say you needed to go home?" Ava asked Gabby with narrowed eyes. "I did. But I found Ezekiel and then asked my mom if I could go to a hot spring with him," Gabby said as she avoided eye contact with Ava. "I'm sure that's what happened." Tao glanced at Agatha before both women grinned, and Tao asked, "A hot spring trip? Isn't that a little bold of you, my apprentice?" It was Gabby's idea, and Hella agreed for some reason. Ezekiel said with a helpless shrug. Tao glanced at the hand Hella was holding before she said, "We were just about to go out and train a bit, but relaxing in a hot spring doesn't sound like a bad idea, and I know the perfect one with a mixed bath." "A mixed bath?" Ezekiel asked as Tao smirked and opened a portal. Everyone stepped through the portal to be greeted by cold and rainy weather, along with a darkened sky. In front of them stood a modest wooden building in a Japanese style. Tao quickly ushered everyone inside the building where they were greeted by some staff. Tao handled everything quickly, and Ezekiel was sent to one side to change and clean off, while everyone else went to the other side. Ezekiel only needed to change his hinge to change his appearance. But he still made sure to remove his real clothes and put on some swim trunks he carried with him after he cleaned himself off. Changed and ready to get things over with, he headed out the door with a towel over his shoulder. The open-air hot spring was just below the entrance building, and you had to walk down some stairs to reach it. While it was open air, they had a large patio cover that protected half of it from the weather, while the rest was open to the sky. With the rain pouring down as it was, the whole place was covered in a low cloud of mist. Ezekiel quickly made his way to the covered section and placed his towel down on a small bench. Afterwards, he stepped towards the hot spring before he sat on the edge and slowly dropped into the water. He let out a relaxed sigh as he settled into the almost stifling water. Ezekiel closed his eyes and leaned back against the edge of the spring where he started to drift off to sleep. Unfortunately, his relaxation was destroyed when he was covered in water by a violent splash. Ezekiel rubbed the water from his face to see Gabby pop up from the water with a smile on her face before Agatha said, "You shouldn't cannonball into the hot spring like that. They're very shallow, and you can get hurt." Ezekiel nodded in agreement before another person jumped into the hot spring next to him. After cleaning his face off again, he saw Ava, who was now playing and swimming with Gabby. He was going to say something about not swimming in the hot spring, but decided to close his eyes and ignore them instead. 00208. A new Stark is born. The impromptu hot springs trip turned out pretty good, even though Gabby and Ava treated the place like a swimming pool. Afterwards, they all went to eat before Gabby and Ava went back home. Ezekiel headed back home himself to get more rest before he woke up the next day to join Tao for more training. Theo was in his training room getting worked over by Tao when his phone started ringing. One of his clones picked it up, and after a few moments it hung up the phone and said, "Pepper's water broke and Tony is freaking out." Theo defended against another attack before he said to Tao, "I need to go." Tao focused another attack that slammed into Theo's defenses before it broke through them and sent Theo flying across the room. Theo was barely able to recover and flip, so he hit the wall with his feet. He jumped off of the wall a moment later as he said, "Can you not end all of our training sessions by breaking past my shields and sending me into the wall?" As Theo hinged into Ezekiel, Tao said, "What? You're no longer slamming into the wall, so that means you're improving." Ezekiel shook his head as he created a portal to go pick up Tsunade, and just before he stepped through it, Tao said, "We'll finish training when you get back. You still owe me 3 more hours." Ezekiel arrived at the medical facility to find Tsunade, Sakura, and Shizune ready and waiting for him. Without a word, he created another portal to Tony's house, where he found Tony and Happy rushing around as Pepper sat on one of the couches in the living room. As Tsunade and the others headed to Pepper to check on her, Jarvis said, "Mr. Stark, Ezekiel has arrived." Tony glanced up from filling a pot with water, and relief washed over his face as he said, I called the doctor we hired. They should be here in half an hour. Ezekiel pointed towards Tsunade as he said, my team will handle it. Tony hesitated for a moment before he said, Jarvis let Dr. Mitchell know that his services won't be needed, but he will still be paid in full for today. Understood, sir. Ezekiel glanced towards the pot as he asked, what are you doing with that pot? I have the towels. Happy said as he carried a large bundle of towels into the kitchen. Jarvis said we needed warm water and towels for a home birth along with a bunch of other stuff. Who said you guys were going to do a home birth? Ezekiel asked in confusion. Where else would we do it? We can't do it in a hospital. Ezekiel chuckled as he said, I already have a place set up. We are taking her there once Tsunade assesses Pepper's condition. Tony glanced over to the couch to see Tsunade with glowing mist coming out of her hands as she checked on Pepper. He turned off the water a moment later as he said, that makes me feel better. I kept worrying about if something went wrong. Happy, who placed all the towels down on the kitchen counter, nodded in agreement before Tsunade said, she's stable and we can transport her over. Ezekiel turned around to find Pepper was now in a wheelchair with Tsunade and the others next to her. Ezekiel glanced towards Tony as he said, need anything before we leave? Tony shook his head as he said, no, at least I don't think we do. Worst case, I'll just portal you back or pick it up myself. Ezekiel said as he created a new portal to the medical base. Before they stepped through the portal, Ezekiel glanced at Happy and asked, are you coming or do you want to go visit Anna? Send him to go visit Anna. Pepper said as she was pushed towards the portal. Ezekiel nodded as he created another portal to Anna's trailer on the movie she was currently shooting. After Happy left, he stepped through the first portal he created and followed behind the others. When he caught up to the others, Tony asked, where are we? A hidden research and medical center I own. Research? What kind of research? Tony asked as he looked around the intersection they arrived at. Ezekiel pointed to the left as he said, cloning and viral research is that way. The cloning program is that way. Ezekiel said as he pointed forward before he pointed to the left and added, medical research and the hospital are this way. Tony froze in place as he looked at the large metallic vault door in front of them. He stared at it for a few moments before he turned to Ezekiel and asked, clones? You are cloning people. How do you think revival saves some of the worst people? Sometimes it's easier to clone a new body instead of trying to cure everything wrong with it. Tony's eyes lit up as he asked, can I see the cloning area? Ezekiel pointed towards Pepper, who was being pushed towards the medical wing as he said, no, you're here for Pepper. Besides, that area is highly restricted and you don't have clearance. Tony put his arm over Ezekiel's shoulder as they moved to catch up to the others and said, of course, I was talking about afterwards. Or maybe another time. Sure you were. As they walked through the hall leading into the medical area, Tony noticed all the doors on each side of the hallway and asked, what's with all these doors? Storage or something? Prison cells. Prison cells? Tony asked as his head whipped back and forth between the two walls with about 50 doors along their length. Yup. We only have like 20 people though, all of which are kept in medically induced comas, so we don't have to worry about them causing any issues. Why the hell do you have prisoners here? Tony asked as he cautiously looked at the doors again. Because some of them are too important to kill currently, and others are kept for a potential trade in the future. What did they do to get locked up here? Ezekiel shrugged as he said, name a capital crime, and they've probably done it. That bad? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, some of them are even worse than that. Tony went quiet as they finished walking through the entrance hallway, and after they entered the main medical wing, Tony looked back as he asked, why is that hallway used as a prison? Wouldn't it be safer to place the prisoners somewhere else? The prison cells were already there when we took this place over, so we just incorporated it into the design. Besides, even if they somehow woke up from the drugs, escaped from the physical and magical restraints. Magic isn't real, Tony said as he cut off Ezekiel. Ezekiel rolled his eyes at the comment before he continued and said, they would still have to get out of the room itself, which is surrounded in a 5-inch thick metallic alloy and also magically sealed. Ezekiel held up his hand to stop Tony from talking as he said, if for some crazy reason one of those people were able to do it, they will also have to contend with everyone who works here. Isn't it just a bunch of doctors and scientists? Remember how strong Tsunade is? Everyone here is like her except for a couple of people. Ezekiel said as he mentioned towards the people around them in the medical department. Tony's eyes widened slightly as he took another look at the people around them before he asked, "They can all punch a hole through a concrete wall?" Something like that. Their conversation died out as they made it to the room Tsunade prepared for Pepper. Ezekiel stopped at the door and patted Tony on the shoulder as he said, "Good luck." "You're not coming?" Tony asked as he stopped at the doorway. Ezekiel gave Tony a flat look as he said, "Your possible future wife is about to give birth, and you want me in there to watch." "That's a good point. So what are you going to do? Hang out here and wait?" "No, I have other things I need to do. I'll be back once I'm finished, though, to check in on you guys," Ezekiel said with a smile. Ezekiel quickly left and headed back to finish his training with Tao before he cleaned up. After confirming the baby wasn't out yet, Ezekiel headed to Hellas where he relaxed on her couch as they chatted. After he recovered enough, they went to eat together before he picked up some food for Tony. After he arrived back at the base and made it to the medical area, Ezekiel stopped at the door leading to Pepper's room when he heard, "It was one time, Tony. We slept together one time without protection, and this is what happened." "I know, but..." "Ouch. Don't squeeze my hand so hard, Pepper, and just relax." "You want me to relax when you did this to me?" Pepper said through labored breathing. Ezekiel decided to not hang around and would wait for Tony to text him when everything was done. Instead, he went to visit Hulk and see how he was doing. He sent a clone there each day, so he already knew, but visiting in person was nice to do once in a while. Ezekiel portaled to just outside Hulk's home, where he knocked on the door. Before the door even opened, Ezekiel smiled as he heard Hulk's distinct stomping as he approached the door. Hulk opened the door a moment later and said, "Hello." "Hi, Hulk, may I come in?" Hulk stepped back and gestured into the house as he asked, "Gonna play game? Want join?" "Not bad, Hulk. You're getting better. But you should have said, 'We're about to play a game. Would you like to join us?'" Hulk mumbled to himself once before he asked, "We about to play game. Would you like to join?" "Better. What game are you going to play?" Ezekiel asked as he stepped into the house. "Scrabble." Ezekiel looked towards his clone with a raised eyebrow as he said, "You really think that's a good game for him? You remember what happened when we tried to play Monopoly? Monopoly is stupid like Banner. Hulk won't play Scrabble." "All right, but you better not get upset if we start winning. You almost broke the enchantments on the table last time," Ezekiel said as he sat down at the kitchen table where the board was already placed. "Hulk, be good. Hulk, no get mad." Ezekiel held back slightly as the game started, but his clone didn't seem to care as it racked up points. As the first game finished, Hulk was in last place while Ezekiel's clone was first with over double his point score. Ezekiel was slightly ahead of Hulk, but only by a few points. To Ezekiel's surprise, Hulk didn't seem upset about being in last place and was even having fun. Ezekiel still decided to keep his score close to Hulk's though, since sandbagging to make sure Hulk didn't smash the table again seemed like a good idea. After they started their fifth game, Ezekiel's phone went off as it played Iron Man. As he answered his phone, he heard a baby crying before Tony asked, "Hey, where are you at?" "I'm playing Scrabble at a friend's house while I waited on the delivery to finish." "How did it go?" Ezekiel asked as he started to place down a new word. "Everything went well, and they just finished a few minutes ago. Go grab Happy and Rhodey, then come join us. I want her to meet her uncles." "You want me to bring Happy and Rhodey to a top secret facility?" Ezekiel asked as he counted his points. "Well, when you put it like that, how about for just a few minutes?" Ezekiel rolled his eyes as he said, "You owe me for this." "Thanks," Tony said before he hung up the phone. Ezekiel glanced at it for a moment before he shook his head and then sent a text to Happy and Rhodey telling them he would pick them both up in a few minutes. Happy was easy to find. He was with Anna in her trailer snuggled up on a couch chatting. Rhodey, on the other hand, was on an Air Force base in the middle of teaching a class. Ezekiel opened a portal to the front of the classroom Rhodey was in and stepped through it before he said, "Yo, I tried texting you, but you didn't respond. Tony asked me to pick you up. He wants you to meet someone." Rhodey frowned slightly as he said, "I'm kinda in the middle of something and can't exactly leave." Ezekiel glanced over the classroom filled with pilots all looking at him with wide eyes before he asked, "How much longer are you supposed to be here for?" "This is scheduled to last for another 4 hours." Ezekiel glanced over the classroom and said, "All of you go take a lunch break or something." Rhodey will be back in half an hour at the most. We're not taking a lunch break. Rhodey said, remember that special craft Tony told you about, the last time you visited his place? Ezekiel asked, you mean that? Ezekiel cut him off as he said, you send them to lunch, and I'll let you fly it for a day. Rhodey's eyes lit up as he turned to the class and said, take an hour lunch, and we'll finish this when I get back. As Rhodey walked towards the portal and the class started to stand up, Ezekiel glanced over them all before he pulled out some money from his storage seal and counted out a certain amount as he said, lunch is on me, guys. Ezekiel held up a stack of cash and ended up giving each person a couple $100 before he left through the portal. About 5 minutes later, Ezekiel, Rhodey, Happy, and Anna were all in the hospital wing and entered Pepper's room to find her and Tony. Pepper was on her bed holding her newborn as Tony stood next to her with a slight smile on his face. Tony looked up first and smiled wider as he said, you guys made it. Let me introduce you to our daughter, Morgan Howard Stark. 00209. Unexpected problems. About a week passed since Morgan was born and Theo was still getting his ass kicked by Tao. Or as she called it, training. Theo would never call it that though over the simple fact he now needed medical staff on duty because Tao was getting more aggressive. Before he would be bruised up and exhausted from sparring, and now he was bleeding and broken from it. As Theo was being healed by Shizun, he said, could you tone it down next time? We are supposed to be sparring. Tao took a sip from her teacup before she said, I already told you I wasn't going to hold back during these training sessions. Besides, you're adapting well enough, even when I increase the power output in some of the attacks I use. Theo let out a sigh as he closed his eyes and let Shizun finish healing his cracked ribs. Once she was finished, Theo portaled her back to base before he took a quick shower and headed to Hellas. Once there, he ended up taking a nap on her couch as she watched some vibe videos of people customizing Gunpla kits. She had yet to start her first real kit and was in the process of learning different things people did before she started her own. After a couple hours, Hella woke up Ezekiel before they went out to eat. Afterwards, Ezekiel left to go meet up with Fisk about the first project he was working on. Ezekiel portaled onto the roof of a row house in Hell's Kitchen before he headed into the building. As he worked his way down to the ground floor, he glanced around at the currently bare floors. All of them were gutted except for anything load-bearing, and those were all fixed or replaced. Otherwise, each floor was almost barren as it waited for the rest of the work to be done. Ezekiel found Fisk on the first floor as he talked with a couple people over a table. As he approached Fisk, and the others noticed him before Fisk said, I didn't expect to see you here. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, I just wanted to check on my investment and see how things were going. After you fixed the issues with our permits, we haven't had any issues with the city or the inspectors. Ezekiel reached the table and glanced at the blueprints as he said, yeah, you shouldn't have any issues going forward with the rest of the project. What do you think of the layout? Fisk asked as he pointed to the first floor on the blueprints. Ezekiel looked it over as he asked, you removed 2 apartments? With how small they were, it made more sense to remove a couple of them and give everyone else more room. Fisk said as he pointed to the new design and added, with 4 apartments instead of 6 per floor, each tenant gains almost 400 square feet. Ezekiel nodded as he said, it looks like you took my advice seriously and aren't doing this for profit. You're the one footing the bill, and you gave me a target budget. Besides, it's less money to build 4 apartments compared to 6, and we even have room to build a laundry room for the building in the basement. Another man that Ezekiel recognized as the henchman who answered the door at Fisk's apartment happily pointed to the map and said, we also reinforced the floors and added soundproofing to them, so people don't have to worry about noisy neighbors. It made the ceiling height a few inches lower, but I think it's a fair trade. We also had money in the budget after removing the other apartments. Ezekiel smiled as he asked, I didn't even think of that issue, but I like it. Are you planning to use better insulated materials between the apartments? Fisk nodded as he pointed to the outside walls of the apartments and said, mainly for the outside walls, but we also plan to use it for each of the bedrooms as well to help keep noise to a minimum there. And that's not going to push anything over budget? Fisk shook his head as he said, the sound-deadening drywall is only 4 times the price of normal drywall. The insulation for the walls isn't that bad either. In total, it's less than the cost to build an entire kitchen for one of the units, so there's no need to worry about it. Ezekiel nodded before they went on to talk about a few more things that they changed for the building. After a short tour to see a few things Fisk wanted to highlight, Ezekiel told him to keep up the good work before he left to go meet up with Tony. Ezekiel portaled into Tony's workshop like normal to find it empty before he was greeted by Jarvis, who said, "Mr. Stark is currently in the living room with Mississippi Potts and Morgan." "Oh, you're calling her Morgan and not Mississippi Stark? Or Stark Jr.? Morgan seems like the most appropriate type of address to use for now," Jarvis said as Ezekiel opened the door that led up to the living room. In the living room, he found Tony and Pepper seated on the couch close together as they quietly talked and watched Morgan, who was asleep in a child carrier. Tony glanced over and put a finger to his mouth, and once Ezekiel was closer, he said, "She just fell asleep." Ezekiel smirked and rubbed the top of Tony's head as he said in a playful tone, "Look at you being all responsible and acting like an adult." Tony swatted Ezekiel's hand away as he said, "Stop messing around." Pepper chuckled almost silently before she said, "He's right though. You've been acting even more like an adult than normal." Tony frowned slightly as Pepper pulled him closer to her and said, "I like it though." Tony's frown disappeared and was replaced by a stupid smile as he wrapped an arm around Pepper. Ezekiel glanced around before he asked, "Is Happy still visiting Anna?" Pepper nodded as she said, "We gave him a month off since Anna is almost finished with her movie and doesn't have a project scheduled." "Oh, nice. I'll have to pre-book a room for them at the hotel since they will probably visit Genosha," Ezekiel said as he pulled out his tablet and started to type on it. Pepper glanced up from Tony's shoulder as she asked, "Why'd you stop by anyways?" "I need a reason to stop by. I just wanted to check up on both of you. Do you guys need anything?" Tony shared a glance with Pepper, who shook her head, so Tony said, "Nothing for now, but thanks for the offer. In that case, I'll leave you all alone. Text me if something comes up," Ezekiel said as he created a portal and quickly left through it. Over the next few days, Theo did his normal routine until he received a text from Adrian Toombs about an issue that just cropped up. Theo quickly changed into Ezekiel before he portaled over to meet the man at the office. As he stepped out of the portal, he heard him arguing with someone. "You're out of your mind. No one's gonna pay you. You're a scrapyard, not a garbage dump," Adrian said in a raised voice. "No, fuck you. I'll haul it across town then," Adrian said before he slammed the phone down on the receiver. "Did something happen at Alexe's scrapyard?" Adrian dropped into his chair as he said, "It's not a something, it's a someone. This jackass named Boris is running the place now and is trying to charge us for the scrap we bring in. Where's Alexe at? He wouldn't let someone ruin his business like that." Adrian shook his head slightly as he said, "That's the thing. He disappeared the other day, and this Boris guy is now running the place. I can't even call Alexe, since it says his cell phone is disconnected." Ezekiel pulled out his tablet and started to type on it as he said, "Don't worry about selling the scrap for now. I'll find out what's going on and fix it. All right, we'll just store it on the empty site next door for now," Adrian said as he reached for his office phone to make a call. Ezekiel quickly portaled out of the office and appeared at the main base, where he went to his office. Once he arrived, he greeted a couple people before he started to work on his computer. Within half an hour, people started to stream into the room, and before long, Ezekiel had 12 people in front of him. Ezekiel glanced up at the person directly in front of him as he said, "I want Alexei Sitsovic found as the main priority. Afterwards, I want to know what is going on with his scrapyard." The man nodded before he turned to the other people with him and said, "Squad 1, go interrogate Boris for information. Squad 2, go check Alexei's last known address. Squad 3 is with me, and we will check in on his close relatives." A moment later, everyone quickly disappeared from the room to head to the portal room for deployment. Afterwards, Ezekiel turned back to his computer and continued his own search. While he had looked into Alexei before, after he found out the guy was basically a legit businessman and not a criminal, he left the guy alone and didn't dig anymore. As Ezekiel searched online, he cursed the fact cell phones and other smart devices weren't everywhere yet. Alexei himself didn't seem to have a cell phone yet, but did have a pager. The only issue was the pager was currently off or disabled, so he couldn't ping it. As for finding Alexei with cameras, that was impossible after he left Ezekiel's neighborhood, since the rest of NYC wasn't covered in them. During his search, he did uncover a bit of information about Alexei's family. Apparently, his mother, father, and younger sister were still living in Russia currently, and it looked like he sent them money every month. other than bank records, bills, and some medical documents. Ezekiel found nothing else that would help in the search, so he decided to head over to Hellas and wait for news from his team. A few hours passed before Ezekiel's tablet started to go off with messages. As Ezekiel started to check them, Hella glanced over from her desk, where she was sanding model parts, and asked, "Did your people find something?" "Yeah, I need to go meet them. Can I come?" Ezekiel glanced towards Hella and met her eyes as he said, "If you want to, but it probably won't be that fun." Hella set her tools aside and then stood up before she used a magic spell to clean up. Ezekiel studied her for a moment before he asked, "Do you want to change first?" Hella glanced down at her outfit, which consisted of blue-colored pajama pants with different Gundams patterned across them and a blue t-shirt with Char standing on his Gundam's shoulder screen printed on the front. The outfit was topped off with blue fuzzy socks and Gundam-themed slippers. Ezekiel smirked the tiniest bit as Hella blushed before she used a spell to change into something else. Afterwards, they quickly portaled over to meet Ezekiel's team. They arrived at a warehouse near the main port of the city where Tsukumo greeted him and said, "The target is being held inside by a group of men affiliated with the Russian mafia." "How many?" 20, mostly armed with basic firearms. Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he asked, "And you haven't cleared them out yet?" Tsukumo smiled as he said, "I thought you would want to do it yourself." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Normal humans? They're too weak to beat any challenge. Just clear them out." "Understood," Tsukumo said before he secured his mask in place and disappeared from view. Ezekiel glanced towards Hella as he said, "Let's head inside. They should be done in a few moments." Ezekiel and Hella walked through the door and were greeted by a couple bodies laying on the floor. Within a few minutes, both of them made it to where Alexe was being held, and he was in the process of being healed. Ezekiel looked over the large man and couldn't help but frown at his state. The man was brutally beaten with large purple bruises, cuts, and burn marks that covered his body. His eyes were completely swollen over, and he was currently unconscious as two of the people gave him basic treatment. Ezekiel quickly created a portal as he said, "Take him to the medical wing." Ezekiel left the portal open as he turned to the man who was being scanned by a Yamanaka clan member. As the man finished his work, the two ninjas returned through the portal, so Ezekiel closed it before the Yamanaka member gave his report. Apparently, the Russian mob wanted to take over Alexei's scrapyard and were trying to get him to sign it over. As for why they targeted him in the first place, the man had no idea. But they at least knew who they worked for and where they were at, so that was their next stop. Ezekiel glanced towards the Yamanaka member and said, "Check the rest for crimes they've committed and then punish them appropriately." As the man left to carry out his orders, Ezekiel pulled out his tablet and typed on it for a few minutes before he said, "After he's done and everything is cleaned up, we'll head to the next target." "Understood," Tsukumo said before he sent a message to the rest of the team. Ezekiel glanced over to Hella, who was looking around, and said, "I told you it wouldn't be that fun." Hella smiled a little bit as she said, "It's fine. I need to get out a little more." 00210. Hella has a problem. Within a couple of hours, Ezekiel and his men had rounded up the leader of the Russian mafia and used him to help capture everyone else. They were still in the process of determining each person's crimes, but Ezekiel already found out the main information he wanted to know. Alexe was targeted because they originally helped his parents by bringing him to the United States when he was young. His parents paid a certain amount of money for them to do it. But afterwards, he was considered free, and they left him alone for the most part. That was until the scrapyard started to do really well, and they decided they wanted the business. Instead of the small fee they charged as protection. As for how he was able to own the scrapyard in the first place, it was originally his uncle's, and he helped make it what it is today over the last 20 years or so. As for the scrapyard's name, it was never changed because Alexe was named after his uncle in the first place. When his uncle wanted to retire, he transferred the business over to Alexe because he had no children of his own and basically raised him since he was 10. Alexe not only ran the business well, but also improved it and helped it grow over the last 10 years, which caused this whole issue in the first place. Ezekiel gathered up all the information his team collected and sent it over to the hand. They were instructed to take over all of the assets for the mob and then sell it off. As for the members of the mob based in New York City, Ezekiel was already taking care of them and would handle their personal assets. As for the newer members or low-ranking ones that hadn't committed major crimes, Ezekiel instructed the hand to take them in and turn them into productive members of society. With that out of the way, Ezekiel went to check in with Alexe in the medical wing of the facility. He found the man still asleep after being treated for his injuries. While he would still need time to heal properly, he no longer looked as bad. Hella and Ezekiel chatted for a little while until Alexe finally woke up. He groggily sat up and looked around the room with his one eye that wasn't swollen over for a few moments before he focused on Ezekiel and asked, "Ezekiel?" Ezekiel glanced over at the man and smiled as he asked, "It's good to see you up, Alexe. How do you feel? Like I was run over by a truck. How did you find me, and what happened to those assholes who kidnapped me?" Ezekiel waved off the question as he said, "It doesn't really matter. They've been dealt with and you will never have to see them again." "How?" "They have people all over. Some friends of mine completely eliminated them in New York, so don't worry about how or why. Just be happy they won't bother you again," Ezekiel said with a smile. Alexe laid back down as he said, "Well, that's one less thing to worry about. You're taking this a lot better than I expected." Alexe let out a soft chuckle as he said, "I accepted the fact that I was a dead man once they kidnapped me. Those are the words of a coward. You should have fought back." Alexe glanced towards Hella as he said, "I would have, but they would have targeted my family if I did." "Then why didn't you just sign over your business and the property like they wanted you to?" Alexe turned towards Ezekiel as he said, "When they first approached me, I warned my family something might happen and that if I didn't contact them each day, to drain my bank accounts before going into hiding. I was trying to give them enough time to get everything done." "Your parents still live in Russia, don't they?" Alexe nodded as he said, "With my younger sister." "How come they never joined you in America?" Alexe let out a sigh before he said, "My father is former military and isn't allowed to leave Russia because of that. My mother wouldn't leave without him, so they sent me alone to have a chance at a better life." "What about your sister?" "She was born years after I left, and my parents didn't trust sending her over alone the same way I was with the mob." Ezekiel nodded slightly before he asked, "Why'd they send you over with help from the mob in the first place? Couldn't you come through the normal process?" "Same reason my father couldn't leave. I wasn't eligible for a passport. But unlike my father, who is still somewhat important, no one cared if a young boy went missing. It's the only reason my family didn't join me." Ezekiel stood up from his seat as he said, "Thanks. That gives me a clearer idea of everything. Do you have a phone I can use? I want to contact my family and let them know I'm still alive." "Just rest for now. I already have people working on contacting your family. In a day or so you'll be able to talk with them," Ezekiel said as his eyes changed, and Alexe saw a flash of red before he fell asleep. Ezekiel glanced towards Hella as he said, "Want to go to Russia and find his family? Didn't your team already find them?" Ezekiel led Hella out of the room as he said, "Kinda. I have a general idea of where they went and know their vehicle. But I ordered everyone to start working on the Russian mafia over there, since that is a bigger priority for now." Within minutes, Ezekiel and Hella walked out of a portal in the Russian countryside. A worn-out road was next to them, and a handful of cars drove past the area every so often. Ezekiel reached for his storage seal and pulled out a little display case of cars before he pulled one out and placed it on the ground. As he sealed the case away, he said, "Let's step back for a moment." Hella glanced at the toy car as she stepped back, and a moment later it expanded into a normal-sized black SUV. Hella's eyes widened as she asked, "What was that?" "A technology made by a friend. I'll introduce you to him and his family the next time they are on Earth." As they entered the car, Hella asked, "They don't live on Midgard?" Ezekiel buckled his seat belt as he said, "Normally they do, but they are currently on a long-term research project with a handful of other people." Ezekiel glanced towards Hella as he went to start the car and said, "Please put on your seat belt." "Seatbelt." Ezekiel tugged on his as he said, "It's to your right and clips into that little buckle down there." Hella found it and buckled it properly before she asked, "What's this for?" "To help keep you safe in case of an accident," Ezekiel said as he started the car. Hella frowned slightly as she said, "I'm an Asgardian. I highly doubt anything on Midgard could harm me." "Maybe, maybe not. But as long as you are in a vehicle, you need to wear one," Ezekiel said as he turned on the radio to look for some music for the drive. He quickly found a playlist and hit play before he pulled onto the road and started to drive. As Running Down a Dream started to play, Hella asked, "Wouldn't it be faster to run wherever we are going, or just portal closer?" "It would, but it wouldn't be as fun as this, and besides, we aren't in a rush anymore. So just sit back, enjoy the view and the music," Ezekiel said as the song started. It was a beautiful day. The sun beat down. I had the radio on. I was driving. As they cruised along the road, they chatted about random stuff or different things Hella noticed along the way. While Hella had consumed a good amount of TV and movies, she still lacked basic information about a lot of things on Earth. So whenever she saw something she didn't know, she asked about it. As they drove, Ezekiel had to check a few things on his tablet to make sure they were following Alexe's family. It was around 5 hours later when they finally caught up to them at a rundown motel where they stopped to rest for the night. After Ezekiel stored the car away, they approached the family's rented room, where Ezekiel heard no noise. Ezekiel knocked on the door softly, since it was pretty late at night. After a few moments, a man with a gruff voice asked in Russia, "Who is it?" "I'm a friend of Alexe. He sent me to find you." Ezekiel heard the distinct sound of a hammer being pulled back on a gun before he said, "Mr. Sitsovic, I'm not here to hurt you or your family. I'm only here to pick you up so you can go meet Alexe." Ezekiel heard a woman whisper to the man, "What should we do? Alexe just told us to run. He didn't say anything about people helping him. He didn't tell you because he didn't know I could help him." The people on the other side stopped talking for a few moments before the door started to unlock. As the door swung open, a gun barrel was pointed at Ezekiel's head. Before Ezekiel could even respond, Hella grabbed the gun by the barrel and crushed it with her hand. The people inside the room all let out gasps of surprise as Hella glared at the man and said, "I doubt if your weapon could even hurt Ezekiel, but if you do something like that again." Ezekiel cut off Hella as he said, "I appreciate your help, but these are normal humans who are running from thugs. If they didn't pull a weapon on us, I would think something was wrong. Besides, we came here to help them, not scare them." Hella kept a slight frown on her face, but backed away as Ezekiel smiled and put both hands up in a non-threatening manner as he said, "Sorry about that. She's still getting used to civilian life. Like I said, we came to find you for Alexe." "Is Alexe okay?" the older woman asked with concern in her voice. Ezekiel nodded as he said, "We were able to rescue him before anything truly bad happened to him." "Thank you," the woman said as the corners of her eyes misted up. "If you gather up your stuff, I'll take you to go meet Alexe." Alexe's father stayed at the door and watched Ezekiel and Hella as his wife and daughter quickly grabbed a couple of suitcases. Once they were done, Ezekiel asked, "Do you need the car or anything in it?" The man shook his head as he said, "We stole it." Ezekiel smirked as he opened a portal and said, "That was a good idea." The family of three stared at the portal as Ezekiel motioned towards it and said, "Please step through it." As they walked through the portal, Ezekiel glanced at Hella and said in English, "I really do appreciate your concern for my safety, but you need to relax a little bit when we go out. They could have hurt you." Ezekiel cocked an eyebrow as he said, "The same way the chef at the teppanyaki restaurant could have? He had a knife that he was tossing around and even pointed it at you. I know he was fast, but it was a spatula and you almost attacked him with a sword. You didn't tell me it was some kind of dinner show. I thought he was going to attack you," Hella said with a huff. Ezekiel let out a soft chuckle as he shook his head and led Alexe's family to see him. After they arrived in the hospital room, Ezekiel woke the man up and let him have a reunion with his family. As they were doing that, Ezekiel took Hella out to eat before he went home to see his own family.